My name's Tristan Goulden. I'm the science lead for the airborne remote sensing group at NEON. And so this presentation is an overview of NEON in the AOP. It's got a slightly different flavor than the webinar presentation that you guys would have hopefully almost everyone saw last week. But some repeat stuff. And basically, the presentation is kind of designed to show you a little bit about what NEON is and how the AOP fits within NEON. But also, I'm hoping that people walk away from the presentation with an understanding that for continental scale type analysis and science, that NEON's a good resource because it takes care of a lot of things for you. So you don't have to I won't say you don't have to think about, but you don't have to put the same level of effort in as if you were trying to come up with all of the data required for those types of questions on your own. So hopefully I want you to come away from the presentation with an understanding of what NEON is doing for you and how that enables you to do that type of science. And my preference is that this is not a lecture. In that it's a discussion. I mean, I really think that, I have about 45 minutes here. If I am just talking, then it's not going to take the whole 45 minutes. And so I'm hoping that people are going to ask me questions throughout the presentation. You don't have to feel like you have to save them for the end. And then we can discuss things as we're going through. If we're getting short on time, then we'll speed things up. OK, so again, this is the NEON Observatory. It is a continental scale observatory. We've divided the continental United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico into 20 different eco-climatic domains. And then we do intensive field sampling at sites within each one of those domains. Some of this was covered in the webinar. And what I kind of wanted to highlight first is some of the differences between the different ecoregions or domains that the continent has been divided into. So this map is a little nicer than the previous one in the sense that it colors the different regions so you can identify them more easily. And I just want to show a few images from some of these different ecoregions. And you can see the diversity of sites the diversity of sites within each of these ecoregions. So see like the northeast site. This is kind of a mature hardwood forest. Southeast, down here I have Hawaii, tropical. Over there on your left is Alaska or tundra. Mediterranean type sites in California, and as well as plain sites on the north. And so there's a wide diversity of sites within the entire observatory. And of course, this is by design. We were looking at trying to capture end member sites that represent the diversity of ecosystems across the entire continent. And so a couple points that we want to bring up from this. Yeah, so NEON, what we're trying to do then is give standardized measurements across these diversity of sites. And so it's kind of a coordinated effort sponsored by National Science Foundation, funded by National Science Foundation, to collect standardized measurements and protocols across this wide diversity of sites within the continental US. And so I think this map of all the sites is presented a lot, and also something that Andrew and I wanted to highlight for everyone here is exactly what went into the design of these particular sites and how we came up with the boundaries that define the different ecoregions. So the original theory behind dividing the continent into different ecoregions comes from a paper, or a couple papers, but most recent Ron Hargrove and Hoffman from 2004, which laid out the theory for identifying different ecoregions within the continental US. And so you can go back to that paper and look at the theoretical basis for identifying ecoregions. This image on the top right is an image from their paper where they divided the continental US into 3,000 different ecoregions, right? So 20 is not a totally arbitrary number, but somewhat arbitrary. You can divide the continent into a different number of ecoregions than what NEON has done. And so if you want to look at the exact way that NEON divided the country into different ecoregions, you can go back to neon.doc.0000001. So this is the original NEON science design document. I don't know what document number we're up to now, but it's well into the thousands. But this is the very first document where you can get a lot of that information. And essentially, it's based on a k-means clustering algorithm. For those of you who are familiar with remote sensing, this is a common clustering algorithm that's often used for identifying classes in supervised and unsupervised classifications. And so the original Hargrove and Hoffman paper, they chose several variables to do their clustering algorithm and define their ecoregions. But you can see what I've listed here is the 9 variables that NEON used to define its ecoregions. And I've just listed those there so you can read them. But based on things like temperature and precipitation and solar insolation. And they thought that these variables were going to be the best to divide the continent into domains that would help answer the grand challenge questions that NEON is intended to answer, things about climate change, land use change, and invasive species. So that's why those exact 9 variables were chosen. And so essentially you go through a process of plotting the different variables in this case 9-dimensional space, but I have 3-dimensional space shown here. And then you identify kind of representative areas within that data space to identify the different domains, the unique domains within the continental US. And they originally used 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer resolution maps of all those different 9 variables. Any questions on that? Great. It's an imperfect process. So what this map shows you is when we then define these different 20 domains from the data, what you see is that it's not, you don't see those nice clean boundaries that we show you in those NEON maps. There's some variability within those domains. So not all the regions within each one of those domains exactly match to that kind of that point in space or that we've used to represent the domain. So there's a lot of variability associated with the definition of those boundaries. And you can kind of see here as you move west, that variability increases. So, I mean, you can kind of see from this last map a kind of general idea of where those boundaries were. And so then, the project went through a process of smoothing and kind of getting rid of some of those smaller areas within each one of those domains to try to make 20 different domains. 20 domains was selected for a variety of reasons. They thought it was a fairly good representation of the diverse ecosystems, but also thinking about financial resources associated with continental scale observatory, knowing that there was going to have to be sites identified for each one of those domains. Obviously, we don't have 3,000 domains because then we have to have 3,000 sites. And so 20 was kind of the number that was decided upon that best represented the different regions as well as fit within to the financial constraints of the resources available. And so then they went through a process of selecting core sites within each one of these domains. And the core sites, oftentimes there was several different sites considered in each domain for which would be the core site. And what they did is at each site that was considered in the domain, they went through and looked at, one of the considerations was, how close does that site come to this ideal representation of that domain? How far away from it is it in this data space? And so the sites that generally were the closest to that ideal representation of the domain, those were selected as the core site for that domain to represent the entire domain. And then we also have relocatable sites, which were then selected to kind of represent different scientific questions of interest inside different domains. And so then what we're actually able to do is once those core sites were identified, was then look at, okay, how well do those core sites actually represent the diversity of ecosystems within a particular domain. So you can see in this map, we have the different domains and the core sites located as red dots on the domains. And then the white areas kind of represent regions that are represented well by those core sites, and then black regions that are represented poorly by those core sites. So you can see it's not a perfect system. We definitely have regions with a lot of darker areas, which are poor representations of the particular domains. This tended to be in the western portion of the country because of the high variability caused by the mountainous terrain and topography in those areas. But then you can see kind of up here, we're going to have better representation. So you can think about this as a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, it's bad because there's areas where there's not great representation, but you can also think about it positively in the sense that if we were going to supplement the observatory with observations, it gives us an idea of where the most efficient places would be to supplement additional observations to the observatory, and that would be in areas where we have poor representation. So that was actually an interesting conclusion that came out of the Hargroves and Hoffman paper. That paper was published before the design of the NEON Observatory, but they kind of showed that for the LTER network that has existed in this country for many decades, they suggested sites that would be the most efficient way to supplement that network based on this analysis, because they're going to say you have this existing network, these are the regions that are represented well. If you're going to add sites to this network, this type of analysis can tell you where's the best place to add those to give you the best representation across the continent. Yes?
So how do the relocatable cores work? Do they move around?
So, great question to lead into the next slide. So the relocatables, again, were designed for specific science questions of interest. And you can see there's different, some of those different questions listed in the different panels here, where, the top left, you can see agricultural design. And so there's relocatable sites located in those domains that are specific to agricultural sites, same as forest management, or the aquatic sites, invasive biology. But something I want to highlight is that there was originally urban ecosystems as part of the NEON network, but these urban ecosystems were de-scoped from the NEON project several years ago. And so those are no longer part of the NEON network. Yeah, sad face. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
De-scope sounds very, very nice. Very something.
Yeah. That's probably the best word for it. But
So did the Strion sites become just 3 points and
so Strion was also de-scoped from the observatory, and that
do you remember that well?
and that same
It didn't
de-scoping.
feel like you were de-scoped.
Felt it much worse.
Yeah.
But we move on.
Yeah, we move on.
A design, say, aquatics as opposed to just terrestrial systems.
Yeah, but Strion specifically also had experimental research that intended to add things to the environment, if I'm correct. Like they were actually going to add components to the stream networks and measure the changes over time. So it wasn't just purely observing the natural environment.
It was initially, but it was de-scoped first. And NSF required an experiment as the NEON, and then that was
I didn't know we were going to get into this discussion about descoping. And so all that was happening around the time that I started, which I mentioned was about 6 years ago. So in addition to the core sites, we have these relocatable sites that are designed for specific science analysis. So the name relocatable certainly, maybe to answer your question, insinuates that these sites are going to be moved at some point during the lifetime of the observatory. At this point, there was a fairly large amount of expense that has gone into locating these one time, and it's yet to be seen. There is no definitive plan on when or how the relocatable sites are going to be relocated at this point.
What are some examples of why a site would be relocatable as opposed to more long-term? Like, what were some of the motivations?
Well, so for example, like if we look at agricultural systems, right? So in D10, which is the domain that the Boulder headquarters is in, we have an agricultural site where corn and soybeans are grown. And so a relocatable site was located at that actual agricultural location, as opposed to the core sites, which are supposed to represent sort of wildland areas, not managed systems. And so a relocatable site was in that case, identified as to do analysis on the actual agricultural system.
So for all of the sites that are up here right now, is there instrumentation on all of those, and then the idea would be you would relocate to somewhere else entirely, or is there only instrumentation of a subset of these, and the idea is to rotate through the ones that are?
So just to be clear, the instrumentation at the core and relocatable sites is exactly the same. So we have all the same instrumentation at both of those types of sites. There was just an intention at one point to then move all of that instrumentation to a new site.
But all of the ones that are displayed here are instrumented currently?
Yep.
It's not, okay.
Yep, except for the urban ecosystems.
And the AOP data is collected for the relocatable?
Yes,
Okay.
AOP data is collected the same way for the core sites and the relocatable sites.
One more question.
Sure.
You might talk about this later, so if you are, you can just defer. But at one point, I think in the webinar, you mentioned Neon being open to new sites. Maybe you didn't.
Assignable asset.
Yeah, so there's assignable asset stuff, which I
Okay,
will
so
talk
that-
about at
okay,
the end. Yeah,
Okay. So
yeah.
if, for example, something that came out of this workshop was that there's a need for urban systems, that's kind of off the table.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say anything's off the table. Certainly, if you could go to some granting agency and convince them that, they want to invest the amount of money it would take to set up an urban ecosystem, I'm not going to say that's impossible.
Okay.
There are already urban ones.
Right, I know they did. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, certainly a good argument could be made, that somebody thought this was important at one point. And so if you're looking for money, someone thought it was important at one point, it probably is still important. Okay, so those are the sites and the relocatables. And then remember from the webinar, there's a whole host of activities that's occurring at each one of these sites. Like I mentioned, sort of one of the most noticeable pieces of infrastructure at the sites is the flux tower, which measures all the meteorological information. But then we also have, soil arrays, individuals doing measurements on vegetation, small mammals, insects, and then aquatic water quantity and water quality measurements. And then as well, the airborne observation platform, which is kind of what we're going to be focusing on. And then just briefly again, go into just an image to remind you, this is the airborne remote sensing system. On the left, you have the imaging spectrometer, and then peeking out right here, you have the LiDAR, and then attached to the LiDAR is a high-resolution camera. So then when we went through the design of the airborne sampling at each one of the sites, I mean, it was a carefully considered, we carefully considered a lot of parameters to define the flight boxes that we would cover at each one of the sites. And so, the AOP is intended to cover a regional area around each one of the sites that completely encompasses all of the other sampling activities that are ongoing with the NEON program at that site. And at a minimum, we're going to fly 10 by 10 kilometers, which if you remember from the webinar, that 10 by 10 kilometers is designed to ensure we get enough overlap with coarse resolution satellite imagery to allow scaling between the AOP data and the satellite imagery. And so when we were coming up with our flight boxes, we also looked at maps of temperature, land cover change, precipitation, and the watershed boundaries to come up with our flight boxes. And so it's another example of looking at the watersheds. I kind of wanted to highlight this one on the right. This is Tree Haven, which is a site in our D5 domain, and the sampling area for Treehaven is just this area right here. We defined our 10 by 10 kilometer box around that, but then we found that the watershed containing those sites was well beyond that 10 by 10 kilometer box, and so we extended that box around to capture the entire watershed. This is not possible everywhere. Some sites have absolutely enormous watersheds. It's just not possible for us to sample the entire watershed with the airborne platform. Yes?
Is the flight boxes any more flexible than the on-the-ground relocatable stuff? Say, you know, if we want to be like, okay, if we just get a flight box over this with some funds, is that any more flexible?
Yeah, so I mean, do you mean like flight boxes at the NEON sites or at your own area of interest?
Yeah, another area.
Yeah, so that's again the assignable assets program that I will talk about later. But I will kind of dovetail that question with the fact that, you know, we've come up with these boundaries. The boundaries at the NEON sites are a little bit flexible. You know, for example, just recently, someone emailed us and let us know that at our Soap Root site in D17, the very eastern end of our box ended just before an area where there was a lot of long-term monitoring for a CZO site. And so, you know, we ended up extending our box slightly to the east to also include that CZO site because we think that that is beneficial for the NEON network. Critical Zone Observatory. So there's other different sites that have long-term monitoring for different science questions. We think it's beneficial for the observatory to have that overlap with other long-term monitoring. And so in situations like that, we do consider local situations and will potentially adjust our flight box if there's a good reason to do so. And that one was, you know, particularly straightforward or easy for us to approve because it was just a slight extension of the box. It wasn't like a whole area, you know, 100 kilometers to the west or something like that. And so, you know, the boxes, although we've kind of got our set of boxes now, we do listen to community feedback on how those may be adjusted to improve what we're capturing at each one of the sites.
Is the idea that if you get representation of that, it's amenable to hydrologic modeling based on the rainfall soil flow?
Yeah.
So at the very beginning of the design, there would have been an aquatic side at the outlet.
Yeah, and so, you know, some of the terrestrial sites have aquatic sites coexisting at the same location. Some of the aquatic sites are standalone aquatic sites. And so at some of these terrestrial sites, we'll call them co-located aquatics. We also have the aquatic instrumentation at the terrestrial site. And then sometimes we have just purely aquatic sites that are not co-located with terrestrial sites. But there's not aquatic instrumentation at every terrestrial site. And there's not terrestrial instrumentation at every aquatic site. Okay, so let's get back to the measurements that the airborne observation platform is making. So just wanted to highlight the imaging spectrometer. We call this the NEON imaging spectrometer, or NIS. It was custom built by NEON by NASA JPL. We kind of went through the parameters of the imaging spectrometer in the webinar. You know, the important thing to realize about the imaging spectrometer is that, you know, it's collecting high resolution data, and we have information collected across a wide range of the electromagnetic spectrum with very high spectral resolution, which means we're dividing that range into very narrow bands. And you're going to see a little bit more of this in a couple slides. And then also the waveform LiDAR sensor. And so this is the active sensor that generates its own laser pulse and measures reflections of that laser pulse off of objects on the ground to give us good three-dimensional structural information of objects on the landscape. I alluded to this in the webinar where, you know, NEON provides discrete and waveform LiDAR, where the discrete LiDAR, we have our outgoing pulse here, and then this is some time passes, and then we get this return signal where we're reflecting off objects like the trees. And the discrete return gives us just individual points where we think that we've intercepted an object, where the waveform LiDAR provides this full return energy signature, which gives you a little bit more detail about that three-dimensional structure of objects. And I would like to point out, just to highlight one of the things that NEON is doing is that, waveform LiDAR has not really generally been available in mass quantities really until the NEON project. We're the first ones that are really providing waveform LiDAR data in this volume. Yes?
How does it differ from all the work that USGS does for mapping coastal areas? Because what you see in the continental United States is that coastal areas are pretty LiDAR rich,
Mm-hmm.
and North Dakota is not.
The NOAA, you mean the NOAA coastal LiDAR?
Yeah, the NOAA USGS work that gets done.
So, how does our stuff differ in what way?
Well, you said you made this comment about long form
Waveform LiDAR, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just
So
I call it a good day when I know what LiDAR is.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know sort of what the difference is.
So my belief,
Not
my belief is that what they provide is discrete return LiDAR, which would just be individual points. I can kind of I'll show you an image of that in a second. Which is differentiated from this waveform LiDAR, which is this full return signal. So basically, what we provide is the red line, right? What they would provide is these little spots here along the red line where they think that a return occurred from the LiDAR.
depends on the contractor. So we may get the wave cloud, we may get the cloud data in those things too.
And the waveform as well.
When you say waveform, I'm ignorant. I don't know.
Okay.
What I know is we get the cloud data,
Mhm.
so we would be able to determine, or for instance, what the canopies look like.
Yeah. So that's what we provide. We provide that, and then in addition to that, the waveform.
I'm going to hang in there.
Yeah.
But it's more
Yes.
than others. It's a lot of data.
Yeah.
Well,
What would be the difference between, so when you get discrete data, right, which is just XYZ, what does waveform LiDAR data mean? Like that's what I'm not understanding, because most of the time LiDAR data is discrete.
Mhm.
And whenever you get it, what is different about this?
Yeah, and so, well, let's talk about it. And so, yeah, that's what I was saying. Like waveform LiDAR is not common. It's not a common delivered form of LiDAR at this point. I mean, it's something that we're delivering, but isn't normally part of a waveform or a LiDAR delivery. And so, let's see if I can get close here. So, what the waveform LiDAR is the full recorded outgoing and return energy signature. Okay, and so what this is recording is saying, okay, when the laser pulses, we get a jump in this energy here, then some time passes, and then as soon as we start making contact with this tree, you're starting to see some energy returned back to the system. And we're recording that full range of energy that's returned back to the system for the duration of the entire pulse. Okay? What discrete LiDAR does is instead of recording this whole return energy signature, it's saying, I believe that because of this whole bump here, I believe I've encountered an object here. So I'm going to record the XYZ position of this object, and I'm going to use the time right here to calculate my range and calculate those coordinates. And I'm only going to provide you an XYZ coordinate here. And it provides those 3 coordinates to represent this entire structure here.
So can I make it a little more precise, my question? When you say continuous, are those tick marks that we see there, that is the thing, like how can I get continuous waveform data? Like if measuring, like are we getting analog like thing or?
Sorry, 1 nanosecond.
1 nano. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's getting finer resolution, right? Like in the temporal thing, when we do the return thing, you get multiple returns, and then your returns are much higher.
Right.
Much higher resolution of.
Yeah, so yes, sorry. No, it's not an analog signal, so it's not completely continuous, but 1 nanosecond.
1 nano. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I do have a question. So the processing and I guess the tools and the software to analyze this waveform, I assume, are completely different. So
Yeah,
what
and
do you have
so
available?
that's the point. One of the points I want to make by saying like Neon's one of the first to really provide this waveform LiDAR data. So up to this point, particularly because it's not data that the commercial LiDAR industry has been using, it's very much research grade data. There's not a lot of tools out there and available to use and work with this data. It's one of the challenges for using this data. But we're hoping that by providing the community with this data to work with in areas that may be of interest, then that'll spur innovation and tool development associated with that data product.
What's the sensor footprint?
So, we have two different LiDAR sensors. One has a footprint of about, the laser pulse footprint is about 50 centimeters, 50 to 60 centimeters when it hits the ground. The other one's about 30 centimeters.
What was the, I mean, I can imagine like the added value of the waveform, but what was like Neon's scientific justification for providing that data?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, at the time when Neon was conceptualized, even the discrete systems could really only record a limited number of pulses. So for the first systems that we bought, they would record the first return, second return, third return, and then the last. And anything that was in between the third return and the end was completely lost. And so we knew that there was perhaps a lot of understory vegetation and things like that that the waveform would be able to provide information on that weren't provided in those discrete returns. Now that being said, since that has happened, systems now are actually able to record 15 discrete return pulses. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with waveform LiDAR data and whether how much more are you getting out of the full waveform than 15 returns, 15 discrete returns. Things like that.
Can I a quick question also? One of the difficulties of working with LiDAR data is too much of it, right? Like you have to have a separate pipeline. How does this work? Like if you're collecting this high resolution data, how much more is it compared to regular discrete LiDAR?
A lot more.
How much is that?
Yeah. Well, in terms of just data volume,
Yeah.
I mean, our typical point cloud file, if that's like, in tens of megabytes, could be tens of gigabytes per waveform file. Yeah. And so one of the challenges we had, obviously there's not a lot of tools, one of the challenges we had was QAing all of the waveform LiDAR data before we published it. And so something that we had to write algorithms that worked on GPUs to crunch through the data. Yes?
Before you move on, I love that these people are so curious about waveform in particular. So Rachel Swedlund sent out an email a few days ago as a link to the speakers. At the very bottom of that page, there's some links to our YouTube channel where we have a half-hour-long seminar talk describing the difference between discrete and waveform LiDAR. So you can dig into those resources more. And of course, ask us during our breaks as well.
And the question was that are all of these presentations are available somewhere?
There will be.
Okay, so I guess we'll move on. So why is Neon using hyperspectral and LiDAR data to study ecosystems? Well, I mean, we didn't make this up. We're not the first ones to do this. I mean, a lot of the pioneering work and for this type of remote sensing for ecosystem analysis was done by the Carnegie Airborne Observatory out of Stanford, which is now the Global Airborne Observatory at ASU. And we have very similar systems to what they've been using. And they've been doing it for a lot longer than us. But it's, we're basing our, measurements on, existing technology. And the benefit here is this fusion of the hyperspectral data, which is able to give you, biogeochemical information on the landscape and particularly vegetation, and the LiDAR, which is able to give you this three-dimensional structural information of the landscape and the vegetation. It's the fusion of those two pieces of information that really allow you to get this vast amount of information about the ecosystem, and then for us to understand then how that ecosystem is changing over the 30-year period of the observatory. Okay, so I just wanted to give a little bit more details on exactly, the information that the hyperspectral data is giving. I mean, I think with the LiDAR data, it's easy to visualize and see the point clouds and understand that three-dimensional structural information that you're getting, because you actually see the LiDAR and see, okay, well, this is what the tree looks like. This is the LiDAR, what the LiDAR is telling me. The surface reflectance from the spectrometer is a little bit more, can be a little bit more difficult to visualize. And so, it really starts with the sun. And what we're trying to measure is the reflected energy off the landscape that's generated by the sun. There's actually a lot of complications to this. What we're actually trying to get is this blue line here, which is the reflected energy off of this particular point on the ground. But we've got all these other sources of energy that are also contributing to that signal. So reflected energy that's scattered in the atmosphere, as well as energy that's scattered from adjacent areas on the landscape. And so what the sensor on the aircraft, the hyperspectral sensor, actually reads, what it actually reads is kind of raw energy from that reflected signal. And then we go through a calibration process and turn that into what we call at-sensor radiance, which is essentially what the instrument is seeing in terms of physical units from that reflected signal off the ground. But what that at-sensor radiance is, which is what we provide that as a product, that changes with where how high the sun is above the horizon, the level of atmospheric scattering that's occurring. And so kind of as a long-term monitoring signal, it's not great because it's going to change, as the location of the sun changes and all these different factors change. So what we actually want is surface reflectance, which is just the percentage of reflected energy that makes contact with that area on the landscape. And so after we get this at-sensor radiance, we go through a process called atmospheric correction, where we correct for just those factors that I mentioned before. And so that's supposed to be a consistent measurement. So regardless of where the sun is in the sky, regardless of what's happening in the atmosphere, we're supposed to get a consistent measurement of reflectance from the ground, which is just the percentage of reflected energy off the landscape. And so if you have that reflectance value, then you should be able to compare that between sensors through time and get a consistent long-term data source for monitoring change. Yes?
Do you provide the before atmospheric correction?
Yeah, so the at-sensor radiance is one of our data products that we provide, as well as the reflectance data.
So what's the range in the spectrum?
So 380 to 2510 nanometers.
What's there?
Yeah.
And how many wavebands you have?
So 426, because we divide into 5 nanometer intervals.
426
Bands.
wavebands.
Yeah.
In addition to the radiance data, do you provide the atmospheric correction algorithm so that could be updated?
Yes. So we use a commercial algorithm that's developed by a company called Accor. But what we provide in our files is everything that we input to Accor. So you could repeat exactly from our at-sensor radiance, and then what we provide in our reflectance data, you could exactly repeat that atmospheric correction that we did.
How similar is this, the sensor, to NASA's G-Light sensor?
So
I ask because we have experience working.
So different from NASA's G-Light sensor. The exact same as NASA JPL's Avarice Next-Gen sensor, but different. But I'm not familiar with all the particulars of NASA's G-Light, but it's not the same sensor.
So it's most closely related to the Avarice?
Yeah, Avarice Next-Gen, which is operated by JPL as well as the Global Airborne Observatory. Okay, so just a little review of spectral resolution. This chart shows, what different satellite remote sensing platforms are measuring. So you see Landsat 8 and Landsat 7. This is kind of the wavelength range. You can see where the NIST bands are in relation to those satellite sensors. And so remember that all that red band showing the NIST bands, that's divided into a whole bunch of 5 nanometer sections. But for say Landsat, it's going to measure its one band. It's going to be in this wide region. So that's going to cover several of the NIST bands. Just to give you a recap of, this is Landsat 8 and what it collects, sample Landsat 8 image. And then on the bottom here, these are spectral curves from Landsat 8 off of different land cover types. And just so I want you to notice is kind of the core spectral resolution associated with those different, different spectral curves. Where then if we compare to what we're getting from the hyperspectral sensor, we're getting this nice smooth curve because we're getting a data point every 5 nanometers instead of those wide ranges between. And so when you get this full data curve, both these are examples from dry leaf and normal non-dried leaves. And so you can see that there's a lot of information associated with the intricacies and the small deviations in the spectral curve that may be associated with water content or chlorophyll or other things like that. We're actually able to pull out of these spectral curves that wouldn't be possible with those lower resolution multispectral data sources. And so I plotted on an example of what that curve might look like from a multispectral sensor. And so you can see that there's a whole other host of information that's being provided by this hyperspectral data set that gives us information to help us analyze the long-term changes in these ecosystems. And so that's spectral resolution. And so the other thing that we're doing is, because we're flying on an airborne platform, we're getting this very high spatial resolution. And so what you can see here is one of our flight lines overlapped on a flight line taken by the exact same sensor, except flown at 60,000 feet instead of 3,000 feet like we normally fly. So this is the exact same hyperspectral sensor on the edges here. It was just flown at 60,000 feet to try to simulate what a hyperspectral satellite might look like. And then you can see the high spatial resolution of the NEON airborne data in this kind of center, where you can actually start making out all of those individual trees in the landscape. You can see it's just not possible in this lower spatial resolution data here. And then all these little red dots are little pinpricks where there was sampling occurring at each one of those individual trees. And so then there's a high or a lot of data associated with that sampling that gives you additional information about the state of that plant at the time of the sampling. And then you can identify that individual plant in imagery and try to relate that information to the spectral curve. But if you look at these pixels here, several of those pinpricks are going to exist within just a single pixel of that lower spatial resolution data. So it would be very difficult to relate those individual detailed field samples to the imagery.
Is there the capability to get soil moisture? Or is that a new NASA sensor going on?
So I never say it's impossible to do anything. I think that yes, you should be able to. There's probably some portion of that spectral curve that relates to soil moisture. Maybe somebody here has.
Well, those same.
Over in the SWAR bands.
Yeah.
Yeah. SAR. In the SWAR.
So you can see like here,
Right there.
water contents associated with some portion of the
But
curve.
that could be animated.
Yeah.
It would only be places where the soil is visible, and then it would be very much like the surface,
Surface.
not any, because what they were trying to do with SMAP was to get at least a little bit more depth of the sensor.
Is that the NASA one?
That was the NASA satellite sensors.
And
And
there's a
they're
snap
Okay.
part two going on.
That's
Yeah.
what I was thinking about.
It's going to go long. Okay, and so, really NEON is designed to allow those relationships between the intense field sampling and this airborne remote sensing data. Remember, this kind of goes back to that, the slide that I mentioned in the webinar where NEON is trying to enable the spatial and temporal scaling and having that, go-between scale that allows you to see individual plants, allows you to scale between those field observations up through this regional scale remote sensing data and into continental scale with satellite
So
imagery.
just to clarify, so are all neon cores flowing at both elevations?
Okay, so no.
Okay, that was just to show.
Yeah, this is just an example. There, back in 2013, we coordinated with NASA JPL, and they did these flights over our site. Yeah.
So the lowest resolution of the current NASA hyperspectral, what is that? Is that a view?
So they have the same sensor as us. It's just that they flew at 60,000 feet and we fly at 3,000 feet, and the instrument has a 1 milliradian field of view for each sensor, and so the resolution just purely depends on how high you're flying.
And that is the lowest you can fly, 3,000 or.
I mean, that's how low the pilots are comfortable.
That's also an issue. The lower you fly, you have to keep the plane going. Also, actually, I'm use hyperspectral for my dissertation and stuff. I'm aware of it. The lower you fly, keeping the speed where you need to record gets prohibitive.
Yeah.
That's why drones are really good.
And what's the frequency of flying the site?
So we've been flying. It's changed as the observatory has evolved. I mean, originally we were going to fly every site every year, but we were just too resource constrained to do that. And then we kind of moved to 2/3 of the sites every year, and then this year coming up, we're moving to 1/2 of the sites every year.
And you rotate them.
Yeah.
And then, I could probably get to this, but you have to get grant money to cover the cost of additional flights every year.
Would there be any scenarios where it could be tasked at a more frequent time interval, just in if a drought is occurring or if there's a large wildfire, there's some interest in
Yeah.
more frequent data or data sooner than
Yeah, and so we've considered that. I mean, it's not something that we've implemented at this point, but certainly we've considered, should we be dynamically adjusting our schedule to take advantage of extreme events like that sort of thing. And so it's not something we're doing right now, but is something that we are considering.
So maybe you mentioned this already, but what's the extent of those flights? Like how large?
So a minimum of 10 by 10 kilometer box. Yes.
In that previous slide, when you had the two scales, right? That's going all the way up to the continental scale, the next one. So, when discussing spatial and temporal scale here, and thinking about the lower resolution scales, are you talking about that primarily through aggregation of the larger spatial units? Or is there something about collecting data at NEON spatial scales that would lead you to different kinds of questions at the continental scale? I think this is relevant for thinking about what kind of socioeconomic data to match these data to.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is that you have to think about when you're going from the NEON field measurements to the remote sensing data, you're going from point measurements to pixel measurements. And so there's some, that's not just purely an aggregation of that data. There's probably some modeling that has to occur to go from those point measurements to raster measurements. And then, similar type of modeling to go from, not similar, but it'd be different type of modeling, but you'd have to do some type of modeling to go from then the NEON regional scale to satellite scale. And I mentioned in my webinar that this is the theoretical construct of the NEON observatory, but to this point, as far as I know, no one has used NEON data and has scaled those point measurements up to the continent at this point. And so theoretically, this is the design of the observatory, but using the NEON data as constructed now, I haven't seen it executed. Okay, so now a little bit more detail into the AOP data products. Some review from the webinar. This is the LiDAR data products that we provide. So there's the point cloud data, then raster data, and then the waveform data. This is an example of the point cloud data. This is a L1 data product, or one of our lower level products. It's in class 1.3 format, and we make it available by flight line as well as by tiles. And generally, at worst, it's 4 points per square meter. But at best, we can get up to over a dozen points per square meter.
The 4 points per square meter at ground level, or at which of the
So I should say, it's 4 pulses per square meter, and so you have at least 4 first returns per square meter. More of a visualization thing. We colorize also the point clouds from the camera imagery, so it kind of makes nice color 3-dimensional models for visualizing the data. And so that's the point cloud. And so I just kind of want to go through a quick little demonstration of then how we go from that point cloud to raster data products, the higher level products, the L3s. It basically requires an interpolation. And so you can imagine that if this is the landscape here, and all these green points are LiDAR returns that we've obtained from the LiDAR sensor, these are kind of located in a pseudo-random pattern on the ground and don't make this nice continuous surface that we want to work with for a lot of our analysis. And so we identify, a regular grid that we want to make our raster from, and then overlay that on top of all of those points. And then we use some interpolation method that would surround each one of these grid points and use those local LiDAR observations to estimate what the elevation would be at that particular grid point. There's lots of different ways to do that. We use something called a triangular irregular network. And we calculate the elevation at all those individual grid points based on the elevation of the point cloud. And that gives us our continuous raster surface, which is all of our L3 products. And of course, if you wanted, you could do that at different spatial resolutions, but we do everything at 1 meter spatial resolution. A little bit more detail on the TIN algorithm. We use it because it's computationally efficient. And basically what happens is that you just create this series of triangles that connect all of the individual LiDAR points, and then you overlap your grid cell location on top of that triangulated surface and pull out the elevation off of that triangulated surface and then assign that to the grid cell. One of the big drawbacks of the TIN is that it doesn't exploit any redundancy in the LiDAR data to reduce noise. And so if we have 4 points per square meter, those points are going to be somewhat noisy. You could use some sort of averaging technique to reduce the noise in your raster surface by averaging those points, but because of the nature of the TIN, it doesn't do that.
Do you get uncertainties those?
So what we do right now is we provide an uncertainty in each individual point in the point cloud. But we don't propagate that through to the rasters yet. Yes. Someday, yes. And again, that, this sort of repeat from the webinar, that gives us our digital surface model, which uses all the points, our digital terrain model, which uses just the ground points, and then a canopy height model is essentially subtraction of those two surfaces. We have our algorithm's a little bit more detailed than just a subtraction, but yes?
I'm curious about the vertical accuracy of the LiDAR
Yeah, so the NEON requirement is to have a 15 centimeter root mean square error on the vertical accuracy of the LiDAR points. Our testing shows that normally we achieve between 6 to 8 centimeters RMSE. We do a couple things. We fly every year before and after our flight season over a runway in Boulder that we have GPS points across the whole runway, and we do that comparison before and after each flight season. And then when we have the opportunity, we collect validation points at our sites and then check it there. Yeah. And so. And then from our digital terrain model, we get our slope and aspect maps as well. Okay, so quickly back to the spectrometer. We're providing that surface directional reflectance as well as that sensor radiance, again at 1 meter, and then vegetation indices and water indices. I quickly just wanted to highlight the calibration procedure that we go through. So every year before the flight season, we calibrate each one of our imaging spectrometers. The calibration process is always traced back to a NIST bulb. So it's a NIST traceable bulb. And so we get this light bulb from the National Institute of Standards and Technology that outputs a particular illumination that's been very well measured by them. And then we calibrate to that bulb every year. And this is really important for the traceability of the sensors through the lifetime of the observatory. Because if we want to know how the environment is changing, we have to remove any uncertainty associated with how the sensor is changing. And so we go through this rigorous calibration procedure every year to really model what's happening with the sensor so we can be sure that any changes we see are not a result of changes in the sensor. And then to go from the raw data that's actually just received by the sensor to that calibrated at sensor radiance, we go through a series of calibration steps of which I won't get into the details of. I just want you to see that we're doing a lot, calibrate this data to make sure you don't have to worry about the quality of the data that we're providing to you. I have separated this out into two separate sections. We kind of have a standard calibration procedures associated with imaging spectrometers that we go through, but we've also done some of our own research that's particular to this type of hyperspectral sensor and developed some additional calibration algorithms that are in are being published shortly. And so it's a very rigorous calibration procedure that we have a lot of confidence in this at sensor radiance data that we're providing prior to the atmospheric correction. When the data first comes back to us in kind of this raw format, you can see it on the left. It looks kind of psychedelic and wavy, and that's because we're just collecting, the sensor's just collecting this line of data, but it's not yet orthorectified or placed into real-world coordinates. And so then we go through a process after we calibrate it of orthorectification to put it in the real-world coordinates and straighten up the roads.
Question. I just can't help to see that what you're showing is very kind of suburban. There's a lot of building things. And I know you show some things that are more like homogeneous in terms of just not landscapes. So when you do those squares, how much of things like what you're showing there are actually parallel?
Like of these examples?
I mean, it seems to me like if you have in the Northeast, and you have a square, you might just fly over suburban landscapes.
Yeah.
And that would be sort of like different from the, so how much of that kind of, having a sense of what your squares are made of?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andrew's going to talk about that in his presentation when we get to it.
Yeah, so well, it's more or less what you're mapping and what you're reflecting trying to get at. So, and I love it. I see that.
Yeah. So that, but yeah, it's funny though. I mean, this is an image actually from our calibration site in Boulder. Yeah, and so it's in order to go through some of these calibration processes, especially the one for figuring out the parameters we need for orthorectifying, it's very beneficial for us to have urban structures.
Of course, you have the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then just to repeat, then we go through this process of taking, so what I showed you before was that orthorectified at sensor radiance, and we go through this calibration process to get that, and then the atmospheric correction to get the L1 surface reflectance, which is what I'm showing here. It's an L1 product. We provide it in HDF5 format. Benefits and drawbacks to an HDF5 format: it's very flexible and allows us to include a host of metadata that wouldn't be normally available with common geospatial formats, which is why we choose it. The problem with it is with its flexibility comes difficulties, or I guess difficulties could be one word, for reading it. It's not like a standardized format, so you can't just pull our HDF5 data into any geospatial software and expect that it's just going to be able to read it, because we've designed that format ourselves. And so we've written an importer for Envy for allow you to look at the data in Envy, but we also provide resources on how to read in that data in Python and R format. And then this is just an example of one of those spectral curves from a tree at one of our sites. Yes?
Is that both saturation and that portion happening across every site?
Yeah, so I want you to notice in the at-sensor radiance data, you can see these little sections right here. So that's where there's like an atmospheric window, and we're not getting any data through because it's being completely absorbed. And so then when we go into the this data, it's just noisy in those sections. Yeah, everywhere. Yeah. And so we actually provide these band windows in the HDF5 file that tell you pull these out. Don't use this data. Again, just to highlight, kind of the power of looking at these different spectral curves. This is pulled from our San Joaquin site, so this is one of our sites. And just kind of highlighting a couple different trees here that are right next to each other. And you can see when we color it with the near infrared band as opposed to the red, these two trees are really different colors. And you look at their spectral curves, and they're very different. And so obviously, this tree is reflecting that solar energy a lot different than this tree is reflecting that solar energy. And so there's something going on with those two trees. And so you're able to differentiate, those types of fine-scale details in the vegetation. Always want everyone to remember, weather is one of the largest problems that we have when we're collecting the data. This example shows that where we were flying, starting here and moving our way south. As we were moving our way south, weather was moving into the site. And then I picked, trees from these lines, kind of as you're going from north to south. It should have, pretty similar reflectance curves. But you can see what happens as the weather. You can get away with just looking at these band combination. It really reduces the volume of data that you need to look at. Same thing for vegetation indices, which a lot of these focus on differences between that visible portion and the near infrared portion of the spectra. We also do some additional derived products. This is leaf area index. You can see the formula that we use to calculate leaf area index on the left. It's an example of that across an entire site. as well as fraction of photosynthetically active radiation, and then surface albedo. Something else we also do when we can is we collect field spectra with a handheld spectrometer. We aren't able to do this at all the sites all the time, but when we can, we go out to our sites, and it provides us with a validation source for vegetation at individual sites. And what you see here is an image of us doing calibration field work before the flight season, where we also use the field spectrometer to confirm that the calibration parameters that we calculate in the lab over the winter are correct.
And you also provide the species that the field spectra.
Yeah. And so we'll go out and we'll collect leaf samples at a cross section of species across the site, and then we'll provide the species as well as the spectra associated with those. And then we have the high resolution camera imagery. Again, just RGB information. There's your buildings again. 10 centimeter resolution. Yeah. L1 product or tiled as an L3 product and in geotip format. So next, I just kind of want to give a summary of the availability of the data products. So how much of these data products are available now. Things don't look so good for 2013 through 2016. That is purely a result of us not having all of our algorithms developed for the data back in 2013. We finished most of our algorithm development around the 2017 timeframe. We haven't gone back and applied all those algorithms and reprocessed everything from 2013 through 2016, and we've started to publish that data now. But also remember that 2013 through 2015, we only flew like 6 sites a year. So even though those years don't look very good, we've flown a lot more sites since then, and so they don't affect the total amount of our complete data set as some of the other years would. We have instances where sensors have gone down or things have happened. Generally, all of the data products that we produce are available at every site that we've flown, but occasionally we have had camera go down, waveform LiDAR go down, and so there are instances where data may not be available.
Tristan, what's the goal in terms of the lag between collecting the data and making it available?
Yeah, so this chart shows the data latency associated with us producing the data. Kind of what I wanted to highlight here is that latency is in the blue, and then the gray is how many sites that we've flown. And so way back in 2013, it was taking like a year to process the data. We only had like 6 sites. But as we've increased the number of sites that we've been flying, we've also been decreasing the total latency. And right now our goal is 60 days from the final flight at a site until the data is available on the portal. Last summer we averaged about 88 days. And one of the reasons for that is that we had planned to fly 2 payloads, but we added our 3rd payload in the middle of the summer. And so we basically doubled our capacity in the middle of the summer, and that caused a little bit of a delay. So right now we're planning to just fly 2 payloads this summer, a full expectation that we'll meet that 60 days. And so then finally, we have the Assignable Assets program. I just want to highlight the fact that AOP isn't the only component of the airborne or of the NEON Observatory that is part of the Assignable Assets program. We have mobile deployment units, as well as sensor and instrument infrastructure, observational sampling infrastructure, the airborne observation platform, and then also you can have access to field operations staff and the field sites. Just a brief overview of how this process will generally work. Just as a reminder, this is where if you wanted to fly your own site with the NEON AOP, then this assignable asset process is how you would go about making that happen. First step I would recommend is to download our assignable asset user guide and read it. Before you submit your application, there's a lot of useful information in there. But then you'd submit an application, and normally, if you're submitting that application as because you want to use the AOP in your grant, then we would recommend submitting your application at least 4 weeks before the deadline of whatever granting agency you're submitting your application to give us enough time to give you an appropriate financial quote for how much that portion will cost. So once you submit the application, then we execute a feasibility analysis. And then we would provide a cost estimate for your grant application and a letter of support. And then if funded, then the Battelle contracts will work with your contracting group to generate a use agreement and statement of work. And then, Battelle is either subcontracted or assigned as a sub-awardee on a grant. But if we're the sub-awardee, then requires an institutional PI within Battelle. And so a lot of times people will go with the just subcontract us to do the work. And then we execute the assignable asset, and we'll deliver the data, and then give you a period of time to confirm that the data is.
And so is that within traditional grant proposals, or where you put the money in, you put the request in?
Yeah, and so normally what will happen is, is say if someone's submitting a grant to NSF, then as part of that grant they'll have to submit the financials associated with the AOP collection, and so we'll provide them with the total cost associated with that.
It'd be interesting to see if NSF moves eventually in the direction of what the oceanographers do, where you apply for ship time, but it doesn't go into your budget.
Right.
Competitive to the ship time.
Yeah, and so that's a model that I think was bounced around. Like, say, our third payload is reserved mostly for assignable asset flights, and certainly it's been thought about. Well, the model should be that third payload should just be funded to fly for the year, and people just apply for the time.
Because it puts a lot of work on Neon to do all these estimates.
It does.
Oh,
It does, yeah, especially when you have NSF funding rates of 5 to 10%. And so certainly we do a lot of work for proposals that never get funded. Mm-hmm. And so, just don't hold me to this. This is just some ballpark example costs so people know, this is not a $10,000 endeavor. You're talking, probably between, tens of thousands of dollars. And it comes out of that feasibility analysis that you do. It depends on where you're flying, how long you need to fly, what the weather's like during that time of year. There's a lot of information that goes into this. And, I say this is a small area. This is not like, we've done assignable assets less than this before. It really depends on a lot of the logistics associated with it. But if you're interested in it, submit for the analysis, and we'll get you a cost back.